I would like to invite you to the last keynote speech, which will be a conversation between Marysia Lewandowska and Jarosław Suchan, Chief Curator from Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź. Please listen to the conversation, enjoy the conversation, and join the conversation because there will be also place for that.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this conference. Unfortunately, I couldn't participate in discussions of the last days, but I've heard that they were really fruitful, so I really regret. Let me introduce to you the main guest of today, Marysia Lewandowska. It is for me a really great honor and pleasure to introduce Marysia Lewandowska to you. Marysia is a Polish-born artist who has been living since 1985 in London. Now you are everywhere. Recently in Hong Kong, as far as I know. And from the very beginning, her artistic activity has been based on archives. The results of her archival researches were shown in many important institutions like Tate Modern and Moderna Muzeum, and also Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź. Marysia will present some of her projects prepared for two institutions in Poland, Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź, the institution I'm happy to work in, and the other institution I also worked, Center for Contemporary Art, Ujazdowski Castle in Warsaw. It was a moment when we, for the first time, worked together. So I'm really happy because of that, and I'm really happy that I can present you the work of Marysia Lewandowska. Afterwards, it will be a discussion about her projects, about her ideas or thoughts about archives, relationship between archives and museum, archives and collections. Yeah, Marysia, the floor is yours.
Good evening. I'm very nervous to speak at this conference, partly because I really, in a way, I have no interest in archives, I should say. And I think this context is very challenging for me to try and persuade you why it's important to think and work with archives, and yet it's also important to undermine some of the habits that are connected with the work of the archive. But first of all, I wanted to thank people who thought of inviting me to this particular conference, and that's Łukasz Biskupski and Ewa Ciszewska, and also to someone who has been looking after me while I'm here, to Martyna Michalska. So what I want to do, first of all, is to say that I've requested for the lights to be quite dim because I really want you, the audience here, to see the images. And I don't care so much about the media transmission, which is why the lights had to be so high and so bright before. So it's like my first really contentious point is that I really care about where we are now, and therefore what I prepared for you today is to acknowledge where we are and to acknowledge the context for me, which was the work both with the Muzeum Sztuki, but also with the Enthusiast project, which I hope some of you have seen the screenings that were accompanying this conference. What I also wanted to say is that I want to dedicate this talk to someone who cared a lot about media, about museums, and who has died prematurely 3 years ago, and that's Ewa Mikina. She worked at the Muzeum Sztuki in the 1980s, but she was an art historian and a critic, and a writer who also dedicated herself to ideas of cyberculture. She established something that was called Cyber Studio and has written about a cyber museum. And I also wondered if maybe some of you might have encountered her. She was contributing to an important conference in Helsinki in 1996 that was organized by Gert Loving and was called Media and Ethics. And what's interesting, as I was looking at that biography and also the biography, if you like, of that conference, was that something that Oliver brought up yesterday in his keynote, which was this plea for museums to accept media work. What that particular conference was about was that it was the first challenge he thought was to focus on potentialities of emerging art spaces, which is the internet, at the time the CD-ROM and telematics. And then he said that the second challenge was to discuss these media as critical forums and dialogical spaces. And he said, how do traditional museums, galleries, newspapers, and other mainstream media react to these changes? What types of alternatives have been developed? But what I am very, in a way, surprised by is that this was 1996. These were the questions of that conference. And somehow, interestingly, we are still asking the same questions so many years later. So the first part, I want to just say something about archives and make a kind of maybe proper introduction how and why I work with them. Archives, like collections, are built with the property of multiple authors and previous owners. But unlike the collection, an archive designates a territory and not a particular narrative. There is no imperative within the logic of the archive to display or interpret its holdings, and therefore the meanings of the things contained are up for grabs. It's a discursive terrain. There is a creative potential for things to be brought to the level of speech, as they are not already authored as someone's narrative or property. In the archive, interpretations are invited and not already determined, which is maybe why there is a creative space that so many artists are responding to. But ownership is really a central concern for a contemporary archival practice, and that is my most, that is something that I really care about, and that is how I come to work with archives, because of my interest in ownership and property. But some media archives attempt to turn limited reproduction rights into a revenue stream. They sell on rights to commercial broadcast conglomerates for extraordinary fees, well beyond the reach of the publics who, through taxation, fund the archive and often donate to its holdings. Effectively, our moving image cultural history, our film and broadcast culture, is being expropriated from the very people who paid and supported its production. So there is a conflict blossoming at the heart of culture, a conflict convened around the property rights that subsist in materials stored in public archives. But after all, creativity is never solely the product of a single author. It always owes debts to the inspiration and work of others, whether they are thinkers, artists, scientists, teachers, lovers, or friends, like the one you are seeing here in this image, who was a very, very important person as a public intellectual, but also a very close friend. Creativity as a fusion point of these singularities cannot survive in a social nothingness. All ideas depend upon their social life, and it is the social life that ensures their longevity, relevance, or extinction. Considering the Enthusiast's Archive as an artwork, and I'm not going to sort of narrate the genealogy of this being an artwork, but just kind of hint at it, also show you some pictures of the installations that was really an exhibition before it was an archive. So considering the Enthusiast Archive as an artwork, which soon will be available online, simultaneously challenges creative practices, replacing exchanges facilitated by frustration and restriction with those of collaboration and generosity. The project was conceived in such a way as to reanimate the public function of archives, collections, and exhibitions in an age characterized by relentless privatization. Traditional model for representing the amateur is that work and leisure are locked in a binary opposition. The absence of one implicates the other. Work becomes the site of rational production, and in simple opposition, amateur pursuits become the location of all that is denied by wage labor, the space of happiness, desire, and enthusiasm. So in one sense, the filmmakers belonging to the amateur film clubs were truly productive, truly creative in the time remaindered by labor, their free time. In many ways, the enthusiast records our forgotten past and prefigures our potential futures. And in that sense, activities of the amateurs offer alternatives, mutual bonds of discussion and resistance. They act as inspiration for a more contemporary sense of collaborative practices. And I hope for those of you who have seen the films that you got a sense that this is definitely not, these were not home movies. These were films that were made under very different conditions. In this slide, you see the celebration at the end of the project, and as you can see, most people in this slide are gray-haired because, of course, by the time we got to find them and to include their films, they are already quite old. So it was almost the last moment to find these people and to get from various kind of personal archives the films that they made. And many of them are no longer with us. So what's extraordinary about these films is that they represent the intimate experiences of people who themselves were caught within these processes and relations. They are not official records or scenes staged for the professional media. They reveal the level of engagement in what has been missing from other records, especially those sanctioned by the state or present in the artistic production. They offer access to what very often remains marginalized, unacknowledged as being of no interest or value. These documents have no status which the official archive could accommodate. They are seen or not seen as part of the collective experience. They are dropouts with no mechanisms of recovery of their contributions to the historical process. In Poland, the clubs, the members and their films were largely forgotten, tainted by their association with the previous political regime and because of their amateur status. And that suggests to me a double repression. It seems they're undesirable, and as undesirables, they lack representation. That's why all kinds of documentary-driven initiatives, and many of them by artists, should find appropriate support, as they often help in identifying similar areas of absence and marginalization. In the spirit of collective activities which were at the origin of the amateur film clubs, their importance in sustaining a reflexive and questioning position finds its equivalent now through peer-to-peer exchanges, open source culture, and Creative Commons, the movement challenging conventional practices of authorship, ownership, and distribution of creative output. We're all extremely aware how the public sphere, and in the net terms, the public domain, is rapidly shrinking and under threat. Now, the filmmakers whose work forms part of the Enthusiast Archive recognize that by allowing to place their films online and under Creative Commons license and establishing an archive, they will be actively participating in the production of new knowledge, creating opportunity for others to interpret and to reuse. This would offer a very different idea of heritage, not a safe haven full of hidden treasures, but a live resource, continually refreshed through use. So the films could become a source of future creative work and not merely inert documents. In pursuing the creation of an archive of Polish amateur film, I want to emphasize the importance of democratizing this realm of imagery that defines the past and constitutes a public history, and simultaneously to warn against its privatization. That's all I will say about the Enthusiasm project. And now I want to move on to another project which concerns museums, and especially the Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź. I often ask myself a question, what is attractive to museums to be working directly with artists on projects intervening into their practices, habits, and hierarchies? To take up a space and launch a disagreement, perhaps to create dissensus, to invite interpretations. What are the consequences of an engagement with an artist? But we also are all very well aware that museums today are run more like corporations, with boards of trustees, business interests, sponsors, gifts, deals, visibility strategies, as we are all, witness this in many museums. Maintenance of cultural institutions requires strange alliances. You may ask, why is Deutsche Bank or BP, British Petroleum, main sponsors, one of the Frieze Art Fair in London and the other of Tate Modern? But what I want to discuss is a project called the Tender Museum, in which images of the Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź, which I found in media and film archives, sound recordings enclosed by copyright and private photographic collections, are combined in the process of redistributing and fictionalizing my encounter with archival sources. And the finding, I thought maybe I will play something here if I can get this to work. Right. Here. Okay. this is silent, so. In the act of researching and recovering the figure of Urszula Czartoryska, who died in 1998, who was a critic and curator, but also a wife of the Muzeum Sztuki prominent director Ryszard Stanisławski, who died in 2000, a different picture emerges as to the role she played in shaping the museum's celebrated status. By setting up an imaginary conversation between myself and Czartoryska, who I never met, I was interested in testing how affect disrupts cultural knowledge and introduces excess to a well-rehearsed set of legitimations. What you're seeing here is the first broadcast in the 1970s. I think this is 1974. This is a broadcast from the television station in Łódź, from the museum itself. And it's also, strangely, it is their first color transmission, but the color transmission is not really available to us. Somehow it's in this, well, not exactly black and white. But what you see is you see the mechanics of the making of the program and how the director of the museum and how the people responsible for this broadcast are sort of, continually rehearsing in front of us. Establishing of an art collection at Muzeum Sztuki was made through an offering to the citizens of Łódź. This generous act and a culturally significant gesture is still prevailing in the museum today. The work of the original founders, members of the AR group, has been continued in the context of new institutional and political demands of the post-war era, the communist era. And in the case of Muzeum Sztuki, we also encounter a somewhat unusual situation, an institutional exception, where the Poznański Palace on the Więckowskiego Street, which you might have visited, for most of its post-war period, housed both the public museum and a home of its director, Ryszard Stanisławski, his wife, Urszula Czartoryska, and their daughter, Olga. And it was this situation which inspired me to look more closely at the impact of privacy in its public manifestations. It seemed important to examine how the private lives marked by friendships with artists, curators, and writers, professional and family trips, gardening at the courtyard of the museum, parties and scenes of domesticity, and all that social backdrop contributed to the public sphere through donations, special exhibitions, lectures, loans, and the famous Sundays in the museum. These are some of the sources for my project, the now extinct. And because I'm talking about two people who were very, very important, both for the museum and for the public life of the city, I also thought it was, maybe it's important to, for you to hear their voice. If I can find, yeah, right? Okay, I hope, maybe let's try this. Okay, so.
Przede wszystkim w jakimś takim uniwersalnym pojęciu, tylko to jest wybieranie. Nie w tym znaczeniu, że się mówi, że ci są dobrzy, a ci są lepsi, a ci są najlepsi. Tylko krytyka jest pewne zajęcie stanowiska i to zajęcie stanowiska jest uniwersalne. Jak my kupujemy sukienkę tego kroju, a nie innego, to też uprawiamy krytykę, ponieważ nie chcemy takiej, która jest staromodna albo prowincjonalna, tylko chcemy akurat jakąś aktualną.
Okay, I thought maybe translating it very, very briefly, that's Urszula Czartoryska talking about critics and the role of the critic. And she actually compares this to how we always make choices, critics making choices. And in fact, she kind of reveals that when we are choosing a dress, we also want something contemporary and not something old-fashioned and provincial. This ongoing informal dialogue between the two spheres is often rendered invisible in the staging of exhibition displays, but appears to have determined how the museum functioned during the 25 years of Stanisławski's directorship. The writing of history, seen through the subjectivities and marginalization, is a theme which has been most fully developed in the Enthusiast project. But with it, I think at the time, the main concern was to investigate how it was possible for a whole class of creative people and their production to go missing from culture with the introduction of political changes of 1989. So our work, and this was a collaborative project by my former partner and collaborator Neil Cummings, our work as artists resided in establishing a platform, the exhibition and an online archive, reintroducing the values of amateur production and the communism to new audiences and in new contexts. Now, the Tender Museum project proposes a different critical and discursive space where questions of gender, care, and attention are articulated by repositioning a voice of one individual, that of curator and critic Urszula Czartoryska. If there was something missing in my perception of how the museum discloses and discusses its own history, it was the role of women as public intellectuals. So my line of inquiry was to speculate on the relationship between the distinct spheres of the private and public, testing their boundaries and finding the leaps. I detected a movement between marginalization of women and representations of public life, in the way that Hannah Arendt writes about so eloquently. The emergence of society, the rise of housekeeping, its activities, problems, and organizational devices, from the shadowy interior of the household into the light of the public, into the public sphere, has not only blurred the older borderline between private and political, it has also changed, almost beyond recognition, the meaning of the two terms and their significance for the life of the individual and the citizen. The Latin origin of the word privacy indicates the state of being deprived of something. So it is all that more important to perhaps link privacy and marginalization, to trace exclusions from public participation inherent in the organizational forms of public institutions. I was attempting to interrogate a space where certain contributions remained unacknowledged, as there were no structures or systems through which they could enter public consciousness. And if one of those roles of a contemporary art museum is to activate different communities of discourse, we need to create structures and to insist on inclusion of women as well as other underrepresented groups. So what you were seeing until now was, these were the photographs which were given, or I was given access to this archive personal archive by the daughter of Stanisławski and Czartoryska. And what you will see now is how the project existed in the museum. And I sort of, if you like, transformed my encounter with the television archives into simply making this, I guess for those who, I guess it's a generational thing, but this barcode, which is so much associated with the museum, became for me like a sign, the entry point to my project. And the entry point was also all these different types of footage that I found in the Łódź television archives, which were a kind of introduction of the museum through the media. And you can see all the apparatus. Since I had access to private archive of personal photographs, I was struck by how disparate events, such as family holidays, dinners with friends, and birthday parties, and professional events formed one coherent whole. And yet, it was not just a picture of a lifestyle. Their engagement in cultural life of the West over the 25 years at the Muzeum Sztuki was marked by a busy travel itinerary to seminal events in the art world calendar, Documenta, Venice, Sao Paulo biennials, and mixed with pictures taken during vacations in rural Poland. By placing the sequence of images inside the museum, I wanted to encourage reflection centered around Stanisławski's and Czartoryska's intellectual origins and place their personal bond as a significant factor contributing to the experience of Muzeum Sztuki in its public role. There's a tendency when dealing with individual histories to privilege one life over the other, public persona over the private one, suggesting a fear of inferiority. So I tried to inverse that. And what you see here, and there was one room which looked like a studio for radio recording, and it was in that room, which was a kind of mise en scène, where you would hear a dialogue. This was a constructed dialogue between Czartoryska and myself as an artist. So I've written and recorded my own voice as though I was truly in conversation with her. And of course, you realize very quickly that it's a complete fiction, and mainly you realize that because of the difference in the media on which her voice was recorded in 1991 and my voice, which was recorded in 2009. But it was also important for me to kind of reveal this apparatus that allows you to still hear things as they are embedded in the analog source. So the tape from which I have taken her voice looked like this. It's important to remember that I was invited to participate in what was a larger project called Working Title Archive. And I have spent 18 months researching publicly available archives, beginning with the Muzeum Sztuki itself, as well as radio, the film school, and the educational film production company, which were all based in Łódź. And in all of those collections, I tried to identify materials directly related to Muzeum Sztuki. And this inquiry was centered around the museum's representation by the media and understanding the kind of images constructed for a wider public. And following my current interest in dissemination of culture and questions of intellectual property, my focus fell on audio recordings, films, broadcasts and photographs. And it is within this context of a wider research that I was introduced to a family archive which Olga Stanisławska donated to the Muzeum Sztuki eventually, in fact, at that very time. Now, the collection of photographs formed an archive of her late mother and was not previously incorporated into any public institution. The archives of her father, Ryszard Stanisławski, have already for many years been deposited at the Institute of Art in Warsaw. And this is an example of how their separate contributions were valued differently, and therefore what place they as individuals occupy in the historical accounts of the museum. The ideas around tenderness and affect emerged in two ways. And there is a clear indication how important it was for Stanisławski to run the museum as a caring organization, both in his relations with staff and in his strong commitment to education and audience-focused projects. One of those projects is called the Sunday in the Museum, and that was the logo which I recreated as part of my installation. And these are some of the images from various activities, which were pretty wild. They mainly happened in the back garden, and there were happenings of all kinds. And these are the three people who occupied the museum, Ursula, Ryszard, and Olga. And these are parts of my installation. The most extensive and inspiring were these annual gatherings known as the Sunday in the Museum. What also became worth considering was the presence of family life spilling over the museums, the scenes of untroubled domesticity mixed with more official functions populate many of the archival photographs. As you know, the root of the word curator is in curare, a person taking care or the guardian. I had an overwhelming impression that the success of Muzeum Sztuki in its public mandate was closely connected to the economies of affect, often marginalized or excluded from the procedures endorsing the existing systems of representation. The process of demythologizing of the figure of Ryszard Stanisławski was not part of my original intention. I was trying to connect the less known acts of generosity performed by him and Czartoryska and present them as indicative of a set of omissions inherent in the self-image of Muzeum Sztuki itself. It was during his directorship that the position of this iconic cultural institution has been secured. Was that due just to his artistic decisions and political alliances, or has his ethical conduct played an important role? Mediation and negotiation are at the center of this project, both addressing agency of the artist inside an institutional structure. How does the museum empower an artist, and how does the artist negotiate a space for herself in the existing narratives of the museum and its history? Additionally, how does inversing the roles of artist and curator contribute to the reading of the mechanisms of power? By reinserting the contribution of Urszula Czartoryska, I authorized the presence of the former curator, whose achievements, at least as far as I could see, found no proper representation. Constructing a dialogue between myself and the historically marginalized figure of the female curator led to a fictional encounter and provided me with an important generational link. Acting as an artist, I was under no obligation to reproduce any already existing power relations, so I decided to complicate the reading by introducing affect as a more contentious side in the perception of its institutional history. The museum can be seen as a contemporary production site with the archive as its silent engine. And following or part of the project was also, I think I should probably say something about this image. This is the 8th of March, 1981, and 8th of March, at least at the time, was the International Women's Day. And here is, well, as you can see, the staff of the museum are here predominantly women, and Ursula is amongst them, so there were both cleaners and curators and administrators all sitting at this table at the library, and the director has offered this pot of flowers to them as it was traditionally accepted. So this is the affect which I was trying to read in these photographs. This was another site of affect, which was a workshop that the curator of this project, Magdalena Ziółkowska, organized I guess it was a closed workshop, and I know that Łukasz Biskupski, who invited me to this conference, was there at the time, although we really did not speak very much. And there was also a publication which I believe is still available. And I wanted to end with a clip from a project that in fact was another collaboration with Neil Cummings, our last collaboration, which was called, it's a film called Museum Futures Distributed. It is on my website, and I think it's also on YouTube, so you can, it's a half-an-hour film. And it imagines Moderna Museet in Stockholm 50 years from now, or 50 years from 2008, when the film was made. So in 2008, Moderna Museet celebrated 50 years. And we made this film to try and imagine how it may celebrate a centenary. So the film is set in 2058. Oops. It also has Chinese subtitles, which I thought was important to introduce, as this is the future. We will all need to, or if not, we in this room, obviously our children will have to speak Chinese. This is Mandarin. And this was shown at the Taipei Biennial 2 years ago. And let me just try and find a way to play. Okay, here. Oops, no. Okay, here.
Well, a good place to start might be the bifurcation of the market for contemporary art from emergent art practices themselves. Although the public domain has a long genealogy way back into ancient European land rights, commons projects, and commonwealths, it was the advent of digitalization and particularly very early composite language projects in the 1980s, which, and this appears astonishing to us now, were proprietary, that kick-started what were called open, free, or non-market resource initiatives. Of course, these languages, assemblages, and the resources they were building needed legal protection, licenses to keep them out of property and competitive marketization. The general public license, the legendary GPL legal code, was written in 1989. It's not so old. So then text and images, either still or moving, artifacts, systems and processes, music and sound, either as source or assembled, all embedded plant, animal and bodily knowledge, public research and all possible ecologies of these resources began to be aggregated by the viral licenses into our public domain. Landmarks include the releasing of the sequenced human genome in 2001, the foundation of the Multitude Social Enterprise Coalition in 2009, intellectual property reform in the teens, the UN Multitude-initiated microtaxation of global financial transactions in 2013, which redirected so many financial resources to public domain cultural initiatives, and, well, I could go on and on and on.
Now, the force of the archive moves in the direction of the past, of what has been stored, captured, as well as towards the future, as a site of recovery, of potentiality, of the social imaginary. It is what we have in common, not only with those who live with us, but also with those who will come after us. Thank you.
Thank you for the great presentation. That was at the same time a kind of introduction to the history of our museum. Thank you very much. Not so much time left, and I have, this is the list of the questions. I would love to ask you about some other projects that are less known for me than those we work together on. But of course, there is no. There is no.
Okay.
But of course, there is no time to do it. Nevertheless, I would like to ask you about things about the your first project based on archives. How did it come that you became interested in this?
Well, as I said in the beginning, I have no interest in archives, and I will insist on that. And but I think maybe, it's also worth mentioning just a very small kind of biographical part, which leads to answering this question, is that I left Poland in 1985 and went to live in London. And I think at the time, and I was educated in Krakow, in fact, in the same university as Jarosław, some years later. So I think there is a very, very strong tradition, and then it was a necessity at the time for self-archiving. And I used to go to places like Dziekanka in Warsaw, where people like Kulik Kwiek were constantly recording, writing, filming, and the archive that they have is really from that very, very powerful sense that if you don't do it yourself, there will be no record. So I think that very strong sense in the Polish predicament, and especially the communist times, is to self-archive. So when I moved to London in 1985, and I did move there for good, already then I knew this was some beginning for me of a different life. I was already educated, I've already graduated, but the first 4 years of my time in London, I did only one thing, because in a way I didn't know how to be an artist in this under these new conditions. So I started recording conversations with people I met, which were mainly women. And I also started recording various public events, lectures, seminars. And I did that for 4 years until 1989, when my daughter was born. And then I was busy in a different
Is it
way.
called Women's
Audio Archive.
Audio Archive?
But
Yeah.
that came together as a project really many years later. So I gave it that name. I just gave it a name, Women's Audio Archive, but I never made it public at the time. It was just a way of informing myself what was going on. And it was virtually 25 years later, in 2009, that a curator, Maria Lind, invited me to look at this material and to turn it into a public resource. So now it's on my website, and it exists as a website online. And it's a really kind of quite interesting record of the mid-1980s, both in London, in New York, and Canada, which is where I was active. So it is this self-archiving.
Yeah. So intentionally, it wasn't made as an artistic project.
No.
Later on, it became.
Yeah.
So it leads to me to another question. What, in your opinion, is added value that results from the artist's use of archives, comparing to the use by scientists, for example?
Well, it's interesting that you would use this phrase "added value" because it's almost like from
Marxist.
Yes, and kind of economic discourse. I think what is of value is, as I tried to suggest, is that in an archive, it's really like an open field. And I think artists often use archives in order to connect not necessarily with the past, but really to point to how certain processes in the present are connected to precedents in the past. And I think there's a kind of, you can call it an artistic license, but it probably is something more. It's this awareness that you have this agency as an artist, and that you must use this agency differently and to use it politically, which might be not so common in other kinds of projects. So I think it's the politics for me that is of interest of this relationship with the archive.
Yeah. You started work with archives in the 80s. And the 80s, it was a time where also it was a really important artistic phenomenon called appropriation art. I'm talking about art created by Cindy Sherman, Robert Longo, and some other artists from the circle of Metro Picture Gallery. And does this phenomenon somehow impacted you? Because it was also the artistic activity that was based on already existing materials. Yeah?
I wouldn't say that this was seminal for me. What was seminal is institutional critique. So for me, it's so much more important, and really my almost entire art practice is inquiring about relationships with institutions and how art is produced, valued, disseminated, distributed, and what is the role of the institution. So, and I think, for a lot of people, they put a kind of sell-by date for the institutional critique. They just say, this was a time and then it's over. And I really don't think, at least I don't think of this in this kind of way, because there's so much to do to really try and open up these discourses with institutions. And I'm sure you contributing to that as well by inviting artists, by publishing. There are many platforms. It's not the museum itself.
let me continue this this plot because also appropriation art was a kind of institutional critique. It was critique toward the institution of art. Yeah.
Right.
And my question is about the relationships or difference between two artistic practices based on already existing materials. And on the one hand, this is appropriation art that is based on the images taken from art history or popular art. And on the other hand, this is this artistic practice based on the archives. You don't see any parallels. Or what is, in your opinion, the difference between those two ways of using already existing materials? This is only a matter of the nature of used materials or also a different modus operandi?
Let me think. I'm sure there are people here that would like to say something about that. I would say that this, so I'm thinking of, let's say, someone like Sherry Levine, maybe in this mode of treating an already existing artifacts and images as her material, but really to point to the construction why they're considered to be art in the first place. So it's something much more radical in a way and much more complicated. And I think something that still seems to be kind of operating as troubling, because also artists are very protective of their productions. Now, when you go to the archive, there is no one there to protect. And I think there is a different tension. And I think it would be maybe along those lines that they are slightly, they operate different conceptually.
Okay. One question regarding your project about amateur film clubs. As far as I remember, the first presentation of this project was under title Enthusiasts. Yes. But the next presentations were under the title Enthusiasm. What does it mean, this change of the title?
Well, the first exhibition was at the Center for Contemporary Art, where Jarosław was at the time the deputy director. And it was really also inviting people who made those films, and the celebration that you saw was really made for them to participate in something that, this was a complicated project of establishing trust between two artists and also the institution with which we worked, and the people who really made those films, owned those films, but had a very different relationship to those films. And we insisted that, of course, we are exploiting without being exploitative. And we concentrated on enthusiasts, meaning the members of the amateur film clubs in the Polish version of the project, because also many people would have remembered that movement. Now, when the project traveled and was each time kind of readjusted, modified, in London at the Whitechapel Gallery, in Berlin, in Kunstwerke, and in the Tapies Foundation, different conditions had to be created to really make that shift. I mean, in those places, no one really cared about those people. But we thought that this idea of enthusiasm is something that at the time was maybe linked to kind of counterculture. But by the time you move that whole concept to the Western world and the capitalism, it's exactly how it operates in producing capital is that under those conditions, you need this enthusiasm. And in fact, it's expected of you to have enthusiasm, which is a value added to any other expertise that you might have. So suddenly, enthusiasm was in these editions in the Western world, the emphasis was shifted to the whole question of what is enthusiasm as part of labor.
Mm-hmm. You touched really important issue regarding the archive-based artistic projects. I mean, relationship between community and the individual. Usually, archives are made by community, and when they are used by artists, they became a work of the individual artist. What is the relationship between individual and community in your projects? Do you feel to be a kind of, I don't know, spokeswoman of the community of the archives of which you are using, or mediator?
No, I feel like I'm a conduit. It has to pass through me and through the knowledge, the emotional life that I attach to certain situations. You know, when I came to work with Muzeum Sztuki, of course, it was already predetermined that the project was to do with archives, but I didn't know what will be the project. Mm-hmm. And it was really growing on me, this idea that there was someone that was missing and that their presence was missing, and that I had to find a way to kind of reconnect that person with the place which also adored her to some extent, but later forgotten about her. So I really act as this agent, and I suppose, you know, every practice is collaborative, and I really also in that project there was the curator's role was immense, and then the workshop which we had, so there was a lot of different people involved in it. So I would like to think that, as I said in the beginning, that an archive is made with property of others. And I really, really value this idea that because it's made with the property of others, that it then has to be opened up. It really has to be accessible. And I only play this role of someone who puts few things together in order to make that possible.
So what about the authorship in a case of this kind of projects? Is it still sense to talk about this, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I make this difference between ownership, authorship, and belonging. And this kind of allows you a little bit more space to think that it's not so important to insist on ownership as being of a single kind, because it's very, very important that the works that we make are distributed, that they are available, and they're also available for modification, so that the authorship allows you to kind of open up that space. And even though I will insist on saying, yes, this is my project, but the reason for doing that is not because I want to guard it or I want to enclose it. It's because I want to take responsibility for it. And authorship is really that place where I think in the whole kind of ethical discourse, it is where you take responsibility. If you put your name to it, that means whatever you've done with the property of others, you take responsibility for it.
But sometimes the artists that are using the already existing materials, works made by the other, are accused of being a kind of robber, a theft, that robber what is not their property. Of course, this kind of robberies is a part of the whole culture from the very beginning. But do you think, is it any border in this artistic practice we can go beyond?
You know, I always
In
feel...
using the works produced by other authors?
Well, it will always depend on the context. You know, why do that? In itself, it's not interesting to reuse. I mean, reuse is also overrated, or the idea that you can produce something new. I mean, the new is overrated. So if you put that aside, but, you know, if it's a political project, if you think you really need to do this, and this is why, and this is what this is for, then you should be able to feel free to use anything you need, and then you take responsibility for it.
Thank you.
Can we have some questions?
Yeah. There is a time for the questions from the public.
Can you say more about the belonging you mentioned?
Yes, well, I think this difference is that the ownership is very much emphasizing the kind of property relation. Belonging emphasizes the social relation to a group and a community. And I think it's sort of important to remember that there is, I guess, a possibility that you can let go of the ownership, but then you re-establish a different relationship in terms of belonging. We all belong to a culture. We kind of belong to different communities, and you don't need to own in order to belong.
Are there any questions? Other questions?
Hello. I wanted to know what was the reaction of people who was the authors of the films that you used in Enthusiast. When you make the project, what they thought about it?
Well, it was quite a long process. First of all, you know, all these films were not in any one place, and all the clubs no longer existed. So there was really nowhere to go. I only got one link to one person, and it started with just traveling to Bielsko-Biała, which is in the western part of Poland, and meeting one person who then gave me contacts to others and so on. So it took about 2 years of traveling across Poland and finding these films and talking to people who made them. But what you must remember is that very often these people only made one film in their entire life, but they somehow kept that film. And of course, they didn't keep it necessarily because they thought it was a great film. They mainly kept it because it was like a momentum of their time when they were young. And it's a real kind of phenomenon in these archives, is that these people made those films when they were young, but when I was meeting them, they were in their 70s. So they didn't really think of the films, they thought about their lives. And yet the films are an incredible index of filmmaking and a desire to make proper films. So they understood that these films, when they were just in the cupboards in their apartments or inside under their beds, had no value. And I think what we did was we simply created a platform. For us, it was a platform within art to be able to bring these films to speech, to create value for them, and to make them available to others. So once the filmmakers understood that, they actually had no problem with the fact that we truly used their production to create this project. But of course we acknowledged the films as theirs. We never edited them, we never treated it as footage. They are fully there. And then when we approached them again to ask them if the films can be part of an online archive under Creative Commons, by that time they understood why, and they were, in a way, what we were doing by licensing the whole archive like that was to return the gift that they gave to us, to pass it on to others.
Are you still in touch with some of them?
Not really. They, some of them died, and others, we just don't keep in touch. It's kind of done. I hope that when the online archive, there's a possibility that it will be kind of activated by the Modern Art Museum in Warsaw, that they may be, those who are still around will be invited again to kind of mark that moment.
Do you think that your project changed anything in their life?
I hope so.
Yeah.
Well, it's a sense of that they actually made an incredible contribution, which until that moment was not very clear to them. So I hope that they, and it's all also documented in two catalogs that accompany this project. They really now feel part of something bigger. And when the clubs were around, they had the sense of belonging then. But when the clubs were disbanded, and also when they stopped making films, they no longer had an arena. And also, these were mainly working class men. There were also very, very few women who were involved in the actual filmmaking. So there was a whole class of people whose production was simply gone. And, this is, I suppose, an important moment that now they feel, they are visible through those films, and also something else is visible through those films.
Here. Hi. First off, thank you for a truly inspiring talk. I have just one question concerning the two concepts. One is the concept of generosity that you have been talking about throughout. The other is enthusiasm in connection with the art project. And I was wondering if, in your view, both constitute one and the same disposition from the perspective of the author in terms of generosity as something towards someone else, and enthusiasm in terms of the self as something self-feeding.
Well, I thank you for thinking in those terms. I was not necessarily connecting generosity with enthusiasm. I think in the work of artists, but I would say probably in all kinds of cultural producers, generosity is just, we so much rely on generosity inside culture. Nothing could really be produced without these qualities of enthusiasm and generosity. Because, our work in the end is so often, it's immaterial. It's the effect of our actions, practices, that does something for other people. So it's also sometimes quite disturbing how the art market really disturbs those relations by imposing the market value on everything we do. I suppose I have been insisting on a different kind of practice. So I don't really have dealings with the market, but I do have a lot of dealings with institutions. And I think some institutions are also themselves very generous. I think there was another question.
I had a two-part question, actually. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was beautiful. My first question is, in this enthusiast project, which is really interesting, you function, it seems you and Cummings function in a number of roles, artist as archivist, artist as curator. So I'm curious about the selection of the films, these films that you researched and found and sort of stood up as exemplars of the Kino Club movement in Poland. How did you select them? Why did you select them in terms of finding some things, not finding others, highlighting some, not highlighting others? And the second part of this question is, how do you negotiate this role as artist, as curator, artist as archivist? Obviously, many artists are curating, asked to curate, and some curators by extension consider their work artworks or themselves as artists. How do you negotiate this divide? Is there a divide? Is there a balance? Is there a boundary?
First, the selection of films. Now, there are many, many films that are not included in this project, and I think there were mainly two types of films that we encountered. One is propaganda films, and films which were really commissioned for the Communist Party, for the factories, for celebrations, and that's why the clubs were there in the first place. They were sanctioned by the state to produce propaganda, but they transformed into places of, you could say, intellectual freedom and liberation. And these people used film as a way of emancipating themselves from the constraints of the system. But we really concentrated on films that were, you could, to use the sort of cinema term for this, it's the author's films. These people really had something to say, and these are the films we chose. But then we didn't really want to impose the genre, so we decided to divide them into love, longing, and labor, which really describe, the whole of our lives, I suppose. The second part was negotiating artist as curator, or I think, for me, I don't really think in those terms. I think, what do I need to do in a project? And if it needs those strategies or tactics, these are the ones that I would use. I do not worry about whether I am, thought of as curator. To me, it's an artistic project, and it does contain some curatorial strategies.
I'm curious, did you find any parallel phenomenon in other countries?
Well, we didn't research them, but I know there are in former Yugoslavia and also in the Czech Republic and maybe in East Germany, but maybe not to this extent of really thinking about film. Poland at the time was these people were working with Kieślowski and Zanussi and the most with professionals who would come and give workshops to those amateurs. So their aspirations was to be professionals.
Yes. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for your talk. It's a great opportunity to listen to someone talking about art in such a way as you. And thank you for reminding Urszula Czartoryska. It's sort of critic working in art in the way that becomes not very often today. As for my question, how do you feel, how do you see the transformation of notion amateur? Because actually you're referring amateur to enthusiast, art lover. Nowadays, in the context of participatory culture, YouTube and Facebook, amateur, it means something different. Andrew Keane, in the title of his book, saying about how amateur destroy culture. So this is complete transformation. Laurie Anderson, in one of her performances, said once, you know, I have learned recently that I'm not the artist anymore, I'm just a content provider. So everything slowly changes. What is your position towards this?
Yeah, I have to think about it. I think the origin of the project really dealt with, well, at the time, this is from the 1950s till about mid-80s. I mean, that's the existence of amateur film clubs. And I think what was so important at the time to make that distinction was, in a way, they had more freedom because they were amateurs. Under the communist system, the amateur was someone who was non-threatening. So they had an enclave, and there was that sense of belonging, and they really, really exploited that freedom. And the films are a good testament to that. Now, I think that term has gone through many transformations already. I mean, both in art practice, and maybe doesn't have that political potency anymore, because of the very reasons that you say. You know, now the internet has people who are maybe amateurs, but an amateur has a very distinct access to knowledge, and that knowledge is very often unacknowledged. And I think, you know, internet is full of people who are passionate about something and have an incredible commitment and knowledge about something, very often quite narrow. But I think what happens when you take this into different forms of practice is that I think one of the responsibilities of an artist is precisely not to just have this, you know, narrow knowledge, but is to connect these different types of knowledges, these different types of experiences, and to provide, you know, the context for reflection and not for consumption. And I think, these may be other types of activities are more geared towards the consumption. I mean, I'm thinking about the internet is really, it's a different type of knowledge. And I think what the amateur has, he or she has tacit knowledge. And that's a very different type of knowledge. So I would kind of insist that it would be quite good to invest in this idea of the amateur still.
Great. So there is a time for one last question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very interesting and engaging lecture. I was particularly intrigued by your work, the Tender Archive, right?
Museum.
Well, in a sense, it is also like a form of investigating the archive, I imagine, although it's also, as you were explaining, a work of curatorship in the sense of exhibition within the realm of the museum. And I was wondering if you had been fascinated also by other stories, not narrated, of female curators, of women, that you think would be interesting to kind of re-narrate, to explore, to construct an imaginative dialogue with. And I am particularly fascinated, for example, by personalities like Nancy Kaufman, that was a color consultant for Technicolor. And she was the wife of one of the main one of the initiators of Technicolor, and her contribution is acknowledged but unknown, really. But also, obviously, more familiar figures like Iris Barry, for example, like her very contested activity and her retirement in a totally private sphere, to refer again to the public and private that you were mentioning. I know this is a kind of very, not really arranged question, but I just wanted to ask you whether you have other fascinations in this sense.
I have lots of fascinations, but not necessarily in this way, because I work with particular people and particular places and institutions, and I often also have projects that are not necessarily attached to any context. But it is true that, just last week I completed a film which is now shown at the Vienna Biennale in MAK, in the Museum für Angewandte Kunst. And the original invitation was to think about the commons and the museum. But when I researched, again, that museum, I come across a woman architect who, there is one very significant piece in the museum that she made. And, gradually through this research, I actually become interested how she, as an architect, she lived for 100 years, was totally devoted to communism and also worked in China. And since I live in Hong Kong this year, I began a project trying to kind of connect with her vision of China. And I made this film related and kind of excavating my relationship with communism, her relationship with communism, and the communist China. So these things, are not really fascinations. They're more kind of missing links. And I would use an invitation, which this was from a curator, to then pretty much kind of focus on some knowledge that I feel needs to be constructed again. So I think, I don't really look for these things per se. They maybe also by now, a lot of people know how I work, so they invite me to do these things because they would like to learn something about their own institutions as well. Plus, there are lots of battles. It's not all very easy. And I take a lot of time to develop a project. So sometimes, it takes 5 years. So it's it's a very different way of working. I always feel, there is incredible reward in building something over time. And that's the only way that you can actually get somewhere, and then the project lives for many, many years. I mean, if you think of Enthusiasts, this was first presented in 2004. It's over 10 years ago, and it had many different presentations in many contexts. But, it took many years to make. So in that sense, I think it's very nice how the work of the archive slows you down. And that slowing down is also something that I think we need in this immediate culture, the culture of immediacy. So that's, what I embrace.
Thank you very much for your conversation, for being with us.
I just want to add at the end that unfortunately the director's apartment doesn't exist anymore in the museum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the time comes for the closing remarks, and I would like to invite Patricia Pisters and Antonio Somaini as the representatives of NECS community and the representatives of steering committee.
Yes, Antonio and me are standing here as the old and the new to recall Eisenstein once more. The old and the new steering committee, we mean. So the old steering committee consists of Sophie Einwachter, Peter Schepanik, Alena Strohmeier, who will stay, so they are old and new. But Trond Lundemo, Malin Walburg, Jaap Kooijman and myself yesterday at the membership meeting stepped down. But we have a new committee and that will be all explained by Antonio. But on behalf of the old steering committee and the community of NECS, we really, really want to thank Eva Czystewska, oh, your names are also difficult, Lukasz Bikupski, Mikael Papis Oreszczyna, and all volunteers, everybody who collaborated, the University of Łódź and also the University of Social Science and Humanities of Warsaw. We are really all very impressed by the organizational skills you've shown here. Everything was really very perfectly organized, and I think we can all join in a big applause for all your work.
Yeah, I join Patricia Pisters in thanking warmly the organizers and quoting Eisenstein again. I'm not here to announce the general line that will be given by the future steering committee, which is composed by me, by Francesco Pitassio, Judith Keilbach, and Skadi Loist. We've been elected yesterday, and we are really, really honored and happy to start working for our association for the next 2 years. So I again thank you so much to the organizers, and see you next year. I have the honor to announce the location and the dates of the next year's NECS conference, which will be in Potsdam, near Berlin. And the dates are rather unusual because of the different calendar of the German academic institutions whose semesters end in mid-July. So the dates of next year conference will be the 27th to the 30th of July 2016. So you're all invited to write down these dates on your agendas, and we really, really hope to see you there. So see you next year in Potsdam, and again, thanks to all of you for being here.
Thank you very much. There were many of us involved in the preparation, and I would like to invite local organization team to join me here and all our volunteers to join me here so I can express my gratitude properly. No, I would like to stay, you to stay here as I say different things as closing remarks. So let me thank you for your devoted work, for your hard work and commitment. Without you, it would not have happened. The conference is your success. Congratulations. Of course, I wanted to thank the steering committee to invite us to organize this year's conference in Łódź. It was very interesting experience, and we learned a lot. Thank you for that. I would like to thank our keynote speakers for accepting our invitation and for sharing their ideas with us. I would like to thank you, Krzysztof, Giovanna Fossati, Oliver Grau, and Marysia Lewandowska. Thank you very much. I'd like to present also some numbers which represent this year's conference. We had 355 participants, 4 keynote speakers, 8 workshops, 12 sessions, 93 panels. I hope you enjoyed it all. And I would like to present at least some of the local organization team members, and I would express my great gratitude to Michał Pabiś-Orzeszena, who prepared the program. Łukasz Biskupski, Transmediality in Modern Popular Culture organizer and Project Forum founder. and Karol Jóźwiak, responsible with Alex Kaspar-Klein for Graduate Workshop and Publishers Forum. Whole list of local conference team you can see here on the slide. You can see the conference staff which consists of more than 40 people. And I would like to read your names because you are here and you worked very hard. Ada Wielogórska, Agata Szynkielewska, Agata Węcek, Agnieszka Hawryluk, Agnieszka Wichman, Aleksandra Piotrowska, Aneta Bochnacka, Aneta Staszewska, Artur Pec, Beata Zagozda, Dawid Kwasik, Estera Łuba, Grzegorz Habryn, Jan Marzewski, Anna Felczak, Julia Stopczyk, Justyna Szaferska, Justyna Wal, Kacper Juszczyk, Karolina Ostolska, Karolina Szmygin, Katarzyna Szwarocka, Katarzyna Tarkowska, Katarzyna Woźniak, Kornelia Olczyk, Maja Górecka, Maja Ignasiak, Marcin Wierzbiński, Maria Plichta, Maria Zielińska, Martyna Michalska, Mateusz Dobosiak, Mikołaj Sieniawski, Monika Langner, Natalia Markiewicz, Oktawia Wierzejska, Paula Sobuń, Paulina Małecka, Piotr Kaźmierczyk, Piotr Wychota, Polina Lepakina, Sylwia Kubera, Weronika Rumas, Zuzanna Woźniak. Thank you very much. So have a nice evening and see you next year in Potsdam at the next conference. Thank you very much.